Hello, and welcome to today's lecture on the end of the Roman Empire. I'm your professor, Dr. Rob Steffen, and today we're going to ask that question, right? When did the Roman Empire actually end? We'll go ahead and start by talking about how things fall apart in the West, and then we're going to move to the much kind of longer and more successful Roman East and what we call the Byzantine Empire. From there, we're going to sail back westward to the Holy Roman Empire and even get in touch with the Ottoman Empire at the very end. So let's go ahead and do it. Let's set the scene, figure out how we got to this point in time. It all begins long before Rome, way back in the early Iron Age, and during this period, Italy was inhabited by a large diversity of different tribes, the most powerful and successful of which were the Etruscans. And they were even more powerful than Rome when it was founded in 753 BC by Romulus. And for the next 250 years, Rome was ruled by a series of 7 kings, each of them contributing something to the Roman identity. And while they started good, they ended not so good. And as a result, Lucius Junius Brutus in 509 BC kicked out the last king from Rome and instituted the Roman Republic with the guiding ideology that there's never one king in Rome. Power is always shared by at least 2 magistrates, and then those magistrates are elected by the people. And while that starts out really, really good, by the end of the Republic, right, by the last centuries BC, these individuals who are leading massive armies all around the Mediterranean are getting so powerful that they start fighting with each other for sole control of Rome. And after a series of 3 civil wars lasting about 100 years, Octavian, who then becomes Augustus, is finally able to wrest sole control and very prudently work out an arrangement with the Roman Senate to kind of be the single ruler in Rome. And that's the period that we call the Roman Empire. And it's going to last for about 500 years, at least in the West. And then finally, we move into late antiquity. And this is the kind of either late Roman or post-Roman period that we very closely associate with the rise of Christianity. So, things fall apart. I hope you all remember that book by Chinua Achebe, and it's very much true for the Western Roman Empire as well. So we'll remember that the 3rd century crisis throws Rome into shock after about 2 centuries of things working really, really well. And perhaps nowhere is that better exemplified than the year of the 6 emperors in 238 CE. And the 2 kind of best exemplifications of those are our guy Pupienus over here and Balbinus, right? And they're both kind of terrified that one's going to knock off the other one. And so Pupienus has got this bodyguard, and he's trying to warn Balbinus about the Praetorian Guard. He's saying, they're coming for us. Now, Balbinus thinks that he just wants his own bodyguard to be able to kill him, and next thing you know, the Praetorian Guard busts in and kills them both. And over the course of about 50 years in the middle of the 3rd century, we get about more than 24 emperors. They're only ruling for about 2 years each, so political instability in the 3rd century. Now, as a way to calm that instability, we have Diocletian try to split up the empire and institute a new way of governance, where you've got 2 Augusti, the kind of leading emperors, and then 2 Caesars, the kind of vice emperors. And then after some period in time, the Augusti retire, the Caesars take their place, and then they get new Caesars. And so he does this by splitting the empire into 4 parts, and each one of these tetrarchs, that's the kind of Greek word we use to talk about all 4 of them together, they each have a different part of the empire. And while that works for 1 generation, it doesn't work for 2. And eventually one of the Caesars rises to Augusti and starts to take it all over, and that guy is the guy that we call Constantine. And so he starts way up in York, off the map to the upper left-hand corner, slowly moves his way down to Rome, and in 312 defeats his cousin Maxentius at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge. And it was right before that battle that he supposedly saw the kind of cross in the sky, the Chi Rho symbol, and heard that voice speaking to him, in Latin of course, in hoc signo vinces, right? In this sign you will conquer, has his soldiers paint this on his shield, on their shields and on their armor, and then go out and win the next day in battle. And then he continues to push eastward, and Constantine once again kind of reunites the Roman Empire. Now that only lasts a couple generations, and by the end of the 4th century, the Roman Empire is divided once and for all right? So Theodosius I, upon his death, we get the Eastern Roman Empire and the Western Roman Empire, and that's it for a cohesive Roman Empire. And that's bad news for the West. The East is much stronger at this point in time since the capital got moved from Rome to Constantinople. And Rome itself is sacked a series of 3 times in the 5th century. First by the Visigoths in 410 CE, then by the Vandals in 455. And both of them burn and loot the place, but they don't set up shop there and kind of take over. But then in 476 CE, we get Odoacer the Ostrogoth come in and defeat Romulus Augustulus, who eventually surrenders to him. And that brings an end to the final emperor in Rome, in the city of Rome. That's it for the ancient Roman Empire in the West. But let's look eastward at the Roman, or shall we say, the Byzantine Empire. So again, Rome is sacked for good in 476, making the people of the Western Roman Empire very, very sad. But while they're sad, the Eastern Empire is going relatively strong, right? This is our Eastern little Roman Empire. They're very Christian. They got a cross on top of them. And things are going pretty well. Now, let's talk a little bit about terminology here. Are they the Roman Empire? Are they the Byzantine Empire? What do we call them, all right? So, the ancient kind of populations themselves of Constantinople and of the Eastern Empire there, they called themselves Romans, right? They called themselves Romanoi, and they called their area, right, the Imperium Romanum, or the Basileia ton Romaion, all right? Either way, they are calling themselves the Roman Empire. When we call it the Byzantine Empire, right, kind of used for that Greek Christian East, that's a term that was developed in the 16th century and really only caught on in the 19th century. And so that's kind of modern historians' words for them. They very much thought of themselves as the Roman Empire. So the capital was moved from Rome to Constantinople in 330 CE. And this is kind of maybe when we'd see the start of that Eastern Roman Empire or the Byzantine Empire, however you'd like to call it. And then at this point in time, Constantinople is going strong, right? This is not a weak city here. It very much looks like a Roman city with a huge hippodrome, massive kind of city walls, a huge center of trade and commerce throughout kind of the Mediterranean, and then as well kind of linking up to the Black Sea. Now it's Constantine, the person who makes that move, who also kind of allows Christianity throughout the empire. And we start to think of him as the first Christian emperor, even though it's still debated whether he was actually Christian or not. So we get the Edict of Milan in 313 that says, hey, it's okay to practice Christianity. We get the Council of Nicaea in 325, and that says, hey, Jesus was actually divine. And then we get on his deathbed in 337 CE, the baptism of Constantine. And the reason for that, again, is that he wants to do this at the end of his life because then it wipes away his sins, and he's about to die, so he doesn't have time to commit anymore. But it's not a totally smooth transition to Christianity from there. We actually get one interloper. I like this guy, a guy by the name of Julian the Apostate. All right, so he rules for 3 years, 361 to 363 CE in the middle of the 4th century. And he basically harkens back to ancient Greece and Republican Rome. And he really likes the philosophers like Aristotle and Socrates and things like that. And his kind of take on it is that he sees people following religion just because everybody else is following religion. And he thinks that they need to go back and do something differently. But as you can see from how long he reigned, it didn't last. But the Eastern Roman Empire is not out of the woods yet. They're still fighting a series of battles with these different barbarian tribes that have been pushed westward by the Huns who have come in from Asia. And at the Battle of Adrianople, also known as the Battle of Hadrianopolis, in 378, we actually see the Eastern Roman Emperor, a guy by the name of Valens, killed in battle. All right? This never happens. The emperor never dies in a battle, right? The emperor stays way back in a battle, and then if it's not going well, he runs away. But he actually dies. And what ended up happening is that the Visigoths were able to basically circle form their wagons into a circle, and then as the Romans attacked, they brought out this kind of supplemental infantry and cavalry to attack the Romans, winning a very decisive victory. Now, it's Theodosius the First, shortly after that, the same guy who divided the empire in half for good, who eventually bans paganism. Okay, so prior to this time, even with Constantine, he supported Christianity, but he also did some things that supported the old traditional Roman religion. No more. By the end of the 4th century, we're clearly Christian here. This guy is also the emperor that ends up banning the Olympic Games. And so think about that, right? The Olympics had been going on for over 1,000 years, right? Every 4 years for 1,000 years. And this guy is the guy who brings them to an end because of their association with the pagan gods. Now, the next guy in our story is a guy by the name of Justinian, all right? And you can see by how long he rules, he's in the 6th century here, from 527 to 565, he rules for a really long time. And that's usually a good sign that he was a fairly powerful guy. And he does a couple things. So one, he codifies Roman law. They need a new set of rules now that they've kind of switched to this new religion, and he puts that in writing. He's also the last of the emperors to actually speak Latin as a native language. And then what he does is he moves from the Roman East, right, from the Byzantine East, and he starts pushing westward again. And so what you're seeing here, right, in this kind of darker orange, this is the area he inherited when he kind of came to the throne. And what he was able to do is, under his general, Belisarius, he was actually able to regain many of the lands that were part of the Western Roman Empire. So Italy itself, and then North Africa, and then Dalmatia, this kind of region up here. So we don't have the full-blown Western Roman Empire back, but we get some of it. But one of the things here is that Justinian was a great leader, and those who followed him were not able to kind of keep the lands that he was able to gain. Nonetheless, he did have some lasting contributions, kind of the most famous of which is this building right here, known as the Hagia Sophia, all right? And this was built from 532 to 537, and at the time, this is the largest building in the world, right? Imagine that, building the largest building in the world, and it still stands today. This thing's been standing for 1,500 years. And if you're wondering why they didn't just like tear this thing down when the Muslim invasion came into Constantinople, it's because, like you see, they turned it into a mosque. And so if you ever see ancient buildings, the Pantheon in Rome, the Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, any really, really well-preserved ancient Greek or Roman building, and you're wondering, how did it stand the test of time? 9 times out of 10, it's because it got transferred to the religion of the conquering group, right? So the Pantheon became a Christian church. The Hagia Sophia, once a Christian church, now becomes a Muslim mosque. And when we look at the kind of interior here, you can just see how magnificent it is on the inside, right? All these kind of domes interacting together really must have been a sight to see in classical antiquity. One of the other things that happens during the reign of Justinian is a series of riots. And so chariot racing in the 6th century is huge, right? Everybody goes to the games. Everybody goes to watch these chariot races. And this is one of the few times where regular people have interaction with the emperor, because he's also going to the games. As you can see here, right, the emperor's palace is directly connected to the hippodrome where they'd have the races. And so the emperor just goes out there and sits in his kind of box seating, right? And what the crowd would do is they would cheer, right? And they would kind of shout things at the emperor, we want food, lower taxes, that kind of stuff. And at one point in time, in 532, they get into this kind of shouting match, and eventually, this kind of huge riot ends up breaking out. And so much of the city is burning, and eventually, Justinian's, he like wants to leave, all right? He gets scared enough that he wants to leave the palace, and he wants to leave the city. And it's his wife, a woman by the name of Theodora, who says like, you know what? I am going to be an empress or I'm going to be dead. There's no way that we're leaving this place. And then they end up slaughtering like 30,000 of their people, and well, life goes on for the emperor and the empress and anybody who wasn't killed in those riots. So Theodora is a fascinating person. Again, the wife of Justinian, and she grew up and she was a prostitute in her earlier years. And yet somehow she's able to marry the emperor, who's just taken with her kind of like intellect. And she became his most trusted advisor. And throughout all of the Byzantine world, it still stands as Theodora kind of being the most powerful of any single woman. So Justinian is kind of the bright spot in the kind of later Roman Empire in the East, or the early Byzantine Empire, however you'd like to call it. But about a century after him, we start getting the kind of Arab and Muslim invasion from the East, all right? And so they start pushing kind of westward from their kind of homeland over here off the map. And it's only Greek fire that ends up saving the city of Constantinople in the 7th century. And if you've heard that term Greek fire before, it's essentially this invention where it was used in naval tactics because the fire ignites when it hits the water, and then it burns on top of the water. And if you're wondering where you've seen that before, it's at the end of season 2 of Game of Thrones, right? The wildfire in A Song of Ice and Fire is basically Greek fire, and you can see an ancient depiction of it over here, right? So the Battle of Blackwater, very much taken from the siege of Constantinople in 674. Now, where did the Muslim populations come from? Like, how did we get to this point? So this is all based, right, going back to the Prophet Muhammad, who lives from 570 to 632. And it's somewhere around 610 that he starts kind of preaching. And the basic idea, right, his basic kind of message, right, God is one, surrender to God, and Muhammad is the prophet. And the amazing thing about Islam in the kind of early days is just how quickly this thing spreads. And you can see here in the map, right, we've got kind of the homeland in here, and then within 10, 15 years of his death, they've got all this area, within 10 or 15 years of his death. And they've already kind of pushed up to where they're bumping in to the Byzantine Empire. And within a century, they've moved westward across North Africa, and they've entered Europe through southern Spain. Now, as we move on in the Eastern Roman Empire, or the Byzantine Empire, we eventually get an important split. And this split is between the orthodoxy of Greek religion over here in the east, and then the development of Catholicism over here in the west. And this takes place in 1054 CE. And this ends up not working out well for the Greeks about 2 centuries later, a century and a half later, when crusaders from the kind of Latin West end up sacking the city of Constantinople. And this is really kind of strange because the Crusades aren't about Christians fighting Christians, right? It's about Christians versus Muslims. And yet on their way to the Holy Land, these crusaders end up stopping at Constantinople and then totally destroying and looting the city. This happens in 1204, and if you ever go to Venice, all right, it's crusaders from Venice who are doing this. If you ever go to Venice, and you ever go see San Marco, right, the massive cathedral near the Doge's palace, you can see the remnants from that sacking. So you can see the porphyry statue of the Tetrarchs. That goes all the way back to Diocletian. That was in Constantinople. And you can also see these bronze horses up here, right? And so those were ancient Roman bronze horses that were brought from Constantinople and then put up on the cathedral at San Marco. And at this time, as you might imagine from the city being sacked, right, power within the Byzantine world is shrinking. So the area that it's got is going down and down and down. And we see the Muslim populations kind of starting to expand their territory. And one thing to pay attention to here is that this group is called the Sultanate of Rum. All right? And you can kind of start to guess what that Rum, right, might be. I don't know how to really pronounce it in Turkish or whatever the language is, Arabic. But this is actually the Sultanate of Rome. That's their word for Rome. So the Byzantine Empire comes to an end in 1453 as the city of Constantinople is sacked by Mehmet II, or Mehmet the Conqueror. And so there we see the collapse of kind of the Byzantine Empire. The last guy dies, and the Eastern Roman Empire, right? They still called themselves the Roman Empire. The Eastern Roman Empire in 1453 is finished, right? And you can trace that back, direct descendants from the Roman Empire back with Augustus. But our story's not over. Now we can move back west to the Holy Roman Empire. Now, we saw in the 5th century, right, Western Europe is a hot mess because the Huns are pushing in from Asia, they're moving all these other barbarian tribes around, and the barbarian tribes have enough power to actually go in and sack the city of Rome. And so what does it look like afterwards? Well, eventually, those barbarian tribes start settling down and forming their own kingdom, right? And so the Franks up here, originally kind of one of these barbarian tribes, actually settle down, they convert to Christianity, and what we're getting is we're getting the early start of the modern day kind of nation states that will eventually be called France. So we can see that in the kind of earliest period, this is the area of the kingdom of the Franks, and they start expanding their power slowly over the course of about 200 years until they encompass a little bit of Germany, modern-day Germany, and most of what was kind of what is modern-day France. Now, one of the things that's happening again, right, Muslim populations are spreading incredibly quickly. So within 150 years, within 100 years of the death of the Prophet Muhammad, all right, they moved all the way through Egypt in Cairo, all the way through ancient Carthage and Tripoli. They've crossed the Strait of Gibraltar up into Spain. They've gone all the way through the entire region of Spain, and they've made it into southern France. And that's where, in 732 CE, one of the most important battles in all of history is fought. And this is known as the Battle of Tours, or the Battle of Poitiers. And this is where one of the Frankish kings, right, a guy by the name of Charles Martel, they called him Charles the Hammer Martel, was able to defeat the Muslim forces, and thus creating a very different world than might have occurred if he was not able to win that battle, right? If he didn't win that battle, Muslim populations very likely would have kept spreading over what we consider most of modern-day Europe, and it would been a very different kind of place. Now, Charles the Hammer Martel has a kid, and he's the next king, and his name is Pepin the Short. So, you know, Charles Martel the Hammer, that's an awesome nickname. Pepin the Short, not really an awesome nickname. But his son, back to cool, right? This is Charlemagne. We know him by his name Charlemagne, right? In French, that just translates as Charles the Great, right? So Charles the Great. And on Christmas Day in 800 CE, the Pope in Rome ends up crowning Charlemagne the Holy Roman Emperor. And so on Christmas Day in 800 CE, the Roman Empire is back, and it's holier than ever. Now, we're going to go ahead and fast forward 700 years, and the Roman Empire is still going strong. At least the Holy Roman Empire is still going strong. And so here we have Charles V, who's kind of king of Spain, but also he's the Holy Roman Emperor. And both of these kind of territories almost straddle France at this point. So it consists of Spain, but it also consists of much of what's Germany. Now, especially in that German kind of region, they get into a bunch of problems because the Holy Roman Empire is very, very Catholic. And yet at this time in the 16th century, we get the rise of Protestantism with Martin Luther going to tack up the 95 Theses on the church door. And this kind of comes to a head in something known as the 30 Years' War about a century after Martin Luther. This is a 30-year battle between Catholics and Protestants, and the goal is kind of to get the right for people to be able to choose what religion they want to be, right? What version of Christianity they want to be. And it turns out that at the end of this war, that the kind of lords in these different areas get to choose what they want. So they can choose to be Catholic or they can choose to be Protestant. Now we'll fast forward again another century and a half, and now we're into the French Revolution, right? The origins of kind of the rule of the people and democracy, very much sparked by our own revolution, right, in America. And so we get kings being beheaded and all that kind of good stuff. But one of the kind of results of this revolution is that this guy eventually takes over, right? When France is in shambles, Napoleon the general, and then Napoleon the emperor is able to take over and rule and start expanding his power throughout Europe. And part of that expansion process is he runs into this unhappy fellow right here, Francis II of Austria, and he is the final Holy Roman Emperor. So we are now in 1806, all right? We're 1,006 years after Charlemagne was crowned Holy Roman Emperor, and we're about 1,833 years after Augustus was kind of given sole command of the Roman world with that first settlement. And finally, we have the last Holy Roman Emperor deposed. And so at this point in time, right, the Byzantine or the Eastern Roman Empire has fallen in 1453, and now the final Holy Roman Emperor is deposed in 1806. So end of story, right? Not so fast, my friend. What about the Ottomans, right? So we saw earlier the Sultanate of Rum. And what ends up happening is Mehmet II, all right, when he conquers Constantinople in 1453, he actually takes the title Caesar-i Rum. And what that translates as, very, very literally, is he's calling himself, think about it, the Caesar of Rome. And so with the conquering of Constantinople, he's proclaiming himself the new Caesar. And this ends up sticking as one of the titles, one of the very long titles, of the Sultans of the Ottoman Empire. And so here we've got a list of all the different titles of the Sultans, right? And they're right in the middle, somewhere in the, yeah, right about there. The Caesar-i Rum, right? The Sultans themselves are the Caesars of Rome. And so if this plays out to the logical end, right? The Ottoman Empire goes all the way up until 1922. So up until 1922, we have a leader calling himself the Caesar of Rome. And if you look further east to Russia, right, the word Tsar, right, Tsar Nicholas, that's also the kind of Russian version of the word Caesar. He's also using the word Caesar. In Germany, if it's Kaiser, also the word Caesar. So the Ottoman Empire ends in 1922 when Mehmet VI is deposed after World War I kind of ends up breaking up the Ottoman Empire. But our story's not done yet. Even today, right, in the modern world, there are still people referred to as Rum, right, or Rumlar. And this is like kind of Turkish word for the Greeks that are living in Turkey. And the reason they use this name, right, they're really just calling them the Romans, and they're calling these Greeks in Turkey Romans because the Greeks were from Constantinople prior to it being Istanbul. And so calling this population Rum or Romans goes all the way back to Constantinople, which goes all the way back to Rome itself when Constantine moved the capital, which goes all the way back to Augustus. So, some concluding thoughts. We've got a bunch of different possibilities for the end of the Roman Empire, right? You could think of 330 when the capital's moved, right? The capital's no longer Rome, maybe it's not the Roman Empire. You could think of 476 when the last emperor in Rome surrenders to Odoacer the Ostrogoth. You go to 1453, right? When that consistent line, Constantine moves it to Constantinople, those people end up ruling for another 1,000 years or so, eventually defeated by Mehmet II. You could mark it as that. But by that time, the Holy Roman Empire has started back up in the West, and that lasts until 1806. You could mark it with the end of the Ottomans in 1922. They're still taking the title of Caesar of Rome. Or you could say that it's still going with these kind of descendant populations of Greeks living in Turkey today that in Turkish they call Rum. And so that question ends up being very much up to you as to when you determine the end of the Roman Empire